students not to have to necessarily ask me those questions, but to be able to ask themselves and their peers those questions, so it becomes more student-centered.
Yeah,
So that requires
absolutely.
me planning for it and maybe even teaching or modeling those type of questions they could
Right.
ask each other, ask themselves.
Yeah, so you started to like talk about what you could have planned for and those opportunities because they don't know, and
Yeah.
if they did know, they would,
Exactly,
right?
yep.
And so I want you to think about the particular lesson. So the question's gonna be a little bit different.
Okay.
In your lesson, how did you facilitate or provide the opportunity for students to begin to generate those questions that led to them with the self-directed learning or directing their own learning? How did you facilitate
I
that?
think there was the opportunity for it
Okay.
and like the structure of the lesson, like having them look at the strong model and pull out those things, and even looking at different students' works. So there was like the opportunity, it could have happened. I don't know if I know I didn't do a good enough job of like modeling examples of those type of questions, or even posing the right questions to get them to think about where is the mistake in this work, what's a question they could ask themselves, like those type of
Yeah.
things. So I think
Yes.
there's like, I could see places where that could have happened, I just didn't plan for it, it didn't happen.
And it's almost like you need to be mindful of it. Because
Exactly.
Mark, you asked plenty of questions, and your questions were aligned to the objective that
Yeah.
you had set. No question asked. In fact, I'm about to share many of the questions that you did ask. But when you listen to the examples that I give you, I want you to keep in mind kind of where we're going to
Okay.
move. And so where we're moving is that students begin to generate those questions so that they're leading their own instruction.
Yep.
And so when I share these examples with you, I want you to kind of keep in mind how these examples of questions that you ask can be tweaked to
Okay.
facilitate what we just described.
That
Okay?
sounds good.
All right, so in your lesson, you began by reviewing what they previously learned, just as I described earlier. You had students review the problems and pull out the attributes of the strong model, and that's what led to the criteria that they were already pretty familiar with. The criteria was that students annotated the question, and they also restated for them to draw a picture to represent a problem, and to write a number sentence to represent the problem. Also to solve the problem correctly with the strategy. Once the criteria was displayed along with the strong model, you allowed students to work 1- and 2-step problems independently at their desks while you worked with a small group. You reminded them to look at the criteria and the strong model if they needed help. With this group, you modeled how to work the problem. Once students began working a few on their own, you got up and you circulated to the children sitting at their desks. You asked them questions like, do you know where you can find the steps? And the student said, the criteria. You said, very good. You moved on to another student. Think about it. You can use our criteria too. As you began to work with Destiny, you said, let's look at this one right here. Let's look at the criteria. You read the problem. I want you to look at this. Be sure to annotate, okay? You rejoined the small group working on the carpet. I think you're good. Continue to use this criteria. This, referring to the strong, and this, and you pointed to the strong model. When working with Contraven, who was struggling to complete a problem, you said, what does the question say? So what's your restate going to say? Very good. Always go back and restate the question. When you check Makaya's work, okay, I see you restated. You drew a picture. But one thing you're off is solving the problem correctly. So what was the strategy you used to solve? And she said, skip counting. You said, do you really know how to skip count by eights? You continue to ask questions to her like that, probing her to solve the problem correctly. And then you said, before we move on, is there a way we can check all the steps? The student said again, yeah, criteria.
Yeah.
And you said, you know what I like to do sometimes? I like to go back and look at it and check it ourselves. We can put a 1, 2, 3, 4, and you showed them how to score their
Yeah.
existing work with the criteria. So there was evidence of plenty of questions, but in order to get them to facilitate that type of learning, you see here the opportunity just to tweak your questions just a little bit. It's important to ask questions to support the instructional goals. But it's also important to ask purposeful questions so that you don't limit students' learning. The students should generate their own questions. As students are led to generate their own questions, it's important for them to have the knowledge of the different types of questions and what they can utilize to find those answers. And so a specific example of how you could simply take the questioning and the opportunity you have with your children to tweak it, to get them to move in that direction, one of the suggestions I have here is to take the strong model and the criteria that you have displayed, utilize them in a way that will lead them to an analysis through self-questioning. A way that you can fully utilize criteria is to have students learn to analyze their work through the use of criteria. Once you have met with your students in the small group, you begin to circulate to the higher performing students working independently. A suggestion is to question the student work through the criteria. Destiny, when I look at this problem, I ask myself if you did what we said was necessary for a strong response. The answer is not quite working out. Something is wrong. I know that in the criteria I must choose the correct strategy to solve. I ask, what strategy did she use? Does this strategy give me a reasonable answer? Allow the student to take the time to think about the questions that you've just asked. So you're not necessarily questioning her work. You're questioning her work through the criteria to make her start to train herself in that way, instead of raising her hand and asking you or waiting for you to come. When you're working the next problem, I want you to question your work against the criteria, is what you would tell her. Continue to circulate and support students modeling how to question work against the criteria or even the strong model, having them compare their work to the strong model. In working with students, you'd have them self-question to determine their answers. So just transitioning them from coming to you and you posing those questions to sharing with them what you think when you look at a piece of work in relation to criteria. So again, just a small tweak, but it's something I think that would alleviate some of the things that you noticed in the lesson and have them kind of analyze and draw conclusions at the same time. And by doing this, you would impact other indicators as well. Your academic feedback would be aligned to your objective. Your instructional goal was for them to work those word problems, but why did you include the criteria?
So they kind of had like a guide of what all they needed to do.
Yeah, so your goal was for them to not only master that objective, but to utilize that criteria to ensure that they did, right? So, like we said in the pre-conference, it's not just your criteria, it's for them as well. So, your academic feedback would be specific to that and helping them move in that direction. You'd give them opportunities and you would model thinking and how to solve their own problems. If they're noticing something's not reasonable, if they notice something's not working out, they would learn how to problem solve on their own, and you would model that through your thinking and the utilization of the criteria. You would be addressing the needs of your students more specifically, because even the kiddos on the carpet had that additional strong model that you could have questioned through or had them refer to when figuring out their own errors, like Contraven or Makaya that was on the floor. And then, of course, you could have them self-assess their own progress using strong models and criteria. Okay?
Yeah, sounds good.
So how do you feel or what do you think you could or how could you use what I've just described in future instruction?
No, that definitely makes sense. And like hearing you kind of give the specific evidence, one thing I kept hearing, like as I went around to those kind of higher students, was look at the criteria, use the criteria.
Yes.
But in hearing the kind of examples, those suggestions you gave, I'm realizing I never really taught them. They kind of had a general idea, but I didn't teach them how to use the criteria on their own and think through it. So providing those models of like how I would use it and how I would question, and then kind of question them more once they've been provided that model, questioning them more generally and teaching them how to ask themselves those questions would push their thinking a lot more. Then you kind of made a point that like, not that I would ever try to, but like sometimes when you're too specific with your questioning, you're doing the thinking for them and it can kind of limit their learning.
Right.
So making sure to both model that type of thinking questioning for them, but then once you've done that, put it on them to do that thinking. Teach them how to analyze their own work and figure out their mistakes. So it makes a lot of sense. I can definitely see that shift and the impact that would have on their learning and their work.
Right, and you talked about eventually you want students, we know that students need to be able to justify or their reasoning behind solving those problems. You said we're gonna move on to that.
Yeah.
How might this impact that?
Yeah, it already kind of gives them like the foundation, and they could even, it'd be so cool if they, in their explanation, like, first I tried this and it didn't work, or if they have those questioning strategies, they'll be able to notice those things.
Yep.
So I don't know, just,
Absolutely.
I'm excited to try it out, it seems really cool.
Yeah, just bringing them to a different level because it was a proficient lesson. This is just that piece that
Yeah.
will move them a little bit further. And so because it was such a strong lesson, I want you to identify for me some of the positive things we said about this lesson.
Yeah, we talked about how like the examples and models I provided really helped the students. And I thought it was cool, so that's something I've been working on, but something in our conversation made me think of is like, and I don't know if I did this consciously, but like how the examples and models are gonna look different for different students. So that's something I'll kind of keep in mind going forward, how I provided the example for the whole class, but then the example need to be even a little more kind of concrete and supported for that lower group of students. So
Right.
we know examples and models are important for all students, but the
Right.
level of example models provided
Yeah.
will look different depending on the need for support. So that was really
Absolutely.
cool to talk
Yeah.
about.
An excellent job, and it's really good to see your growth in that area, and the students have definitely benefited from that.
Cool.
All right, we'll now share your scores.
All right.
Okay.